Malaya. Malaya is a game distributed by wargamedownloads.com. If I didn't pronounce it correctly, you can find the link on Board Game Geek. This is a postcard game, so very small map, not many units, very short rules, which is always a mixed blessing to me because on one hand you do not have much to read, but then on the other hand you will encounter situations that are not covered by the rules, in which you have to figure out what to do, how to give an interpretation that makes sense, etc., etc. And these games with such short rules and small maps are often labeled as introductory war games. To me, that is not necessarily true because I find that if you do not have the guidance of the rules, it is good to have a background in wargaming to know general concepts, to be familiar with some ideas, so naturally you can house rule things and still the game works. So I do not know that this is an introductory wargame just because of all that you have to add to make the game work. Anyways, the game covers the invasion of Malaya during World War II, the invasion by the Japanese forces against the Commonwealth that was defending the island, and that was a smashing victory for the Japanese. The game reproduces this. The game gives the Japanese side several advantages, but the victory conditions are still such that the Japanese may win the battle but lose the war, which to me is always a good compromise between historicity and, on the other hand, a game that is still challenging as a game. Let's see how the game works. This is the area where the fight will take place. As you can see, the Japanese player doesn't start with many units on the board, but that player will receive reinforcements. Most of the turns, the British player only receives a reinforcement. In turn 4, the reinforcement goes to Singapore, and it is a reinforcement that cannot move. A turn is divided in a Japanese game turn and a British game turn. At the beginning of the Japanese turn, the Japanese player moves any and all of his units by their movement factor, which is the small number printed at the bottom right corner of the counters. Reinforcements can also be brought in during that phase. That reinforcement there for turn 1 will enter from that X. All the other reinforcements for the next 3 turns will enter from that area there, and the last reinforcement can land in any beach hex on the board, which is important for reasons that I will explain later. Units belonging to the Japanese player can also use C movement if they start in one of these hexes here, the ones with the red dot. These are objective hexes. If they start from there, they can move up to 5 hexes away and land in a beach up to 5 hexes away. So it can be pretty powerful to be able to move around British units. This can be crucial because units can move on land up to their movement factor when they are moving in clear terrain or beach hexes, but they cannot move into these hexes here. This is impassable terrain. As you can see, this is pretty crucial because the British player may be able to exploit these bottlenecks here to defend the objective axis in this area of the board. So being able to sail around those units can be very important for the Japanese player, especially because the Japanese player does not have a lot of time to complete his mission, which is to take control of as many of these objectives as possible. At the end of turn 6, you count how many objective axes are still in control of the British player, and that will determine who the winner is and the level of victory. So after movement, you have combat that takes place between units that are in the same hex. You can enter an hex containing an enemy unit, but you cannot exit it unless because of a combat effect, unless somebody retreats or somebody is destroyed. Combat will be resolved by totaling together the combat factor of the two sides individually. You take into account the entire combat factor of the units involved in the fight. Units that are adjacent can lend support, and they will add half of their combat factor rounded down. So actually this side has a total of 6 and this side a total of 3. Then each side rolls a die, you add that to the combat factor of each side, then you subtract the total modified combat factor of the defender from that of the attacker. You look at the differential, that tells you what happens next. It tells you if the attacker retreats and suffers a step loss, or simply retreats, or if it is the defender that retreats or gets a step loss, or retreats and gets a step loss. But there are some units on the map that are elite units, these ones for example, and they can ignore a retreat result. This is pretty important because that means that these units, if placed in the right position, can really be good to defend a certain area, because it will take the Japanese player a while to eliminate them and to make sure that those units can move through the area that these units are defending. Support is kind of tricky because there aren't specific rules about how you really handle that, how it works, what it entails. My house rules are that if a unit is lending support in a fight, that unit cannot participate in another combat, cannot be the main unit in another fight, and cannot lend support to other units. Also, a unit that did lend support counts as a unit that participated in combat. This is important because of what happens next. After combat is resolved, you have the second move phase, during which units that did not participate in combat can move by an extra hex. At that point, the Japanese phase is over and the British player goes through a similar phase. First move, combat, and second move. A big difference though is that between combat and second move, the British player must check supplies. Only the British player must do that. The British player must demonstrate that his units are on a road or adjacent to a road that can trace an uninterrupted line to Singapore, uninterrupted by enemy units, of course. And this is why this unit here that can land on any beach on the board can be extremely important, because that can be really crucial to cut supply lines for a number of British units, and that of course can be of great help to other friendly units that are still advancing in this direction, because units belonging to the British player that are found to be out of supply during the supply check lose a step, and since some units only have one step, you can imagine how devastating that can be. This is a smart design. I enjoyed it. I really found it remarkable that this design can still create a certain narrative, a certain sequence of stages and events, even in a game that lasts 20 minutes, 30 minutes. And those stages, those events present different types of challenges as the game progresses. I also like, in fact, the fact that the Japanese player has several advantages in terms of number of units, for example, but there are the disadvantages, for example, the position and the restrictive terrain, and British units may be weaker, but some of those are still strong enough to create enough attrition to delay the Japanese player for the time that is necessary for the Japanese player not to win the game. It's not a matter of winning the war, but just to delay the Japanese player enough that the victory conditions for the Japanese player do not apply. And the British player can definitely do that. So for the Japanese player, it's not going to be just a matter of outnumbering the opponent and just sending a frontal charge. That is not gonna be good enough, not enough to, not fast enough. So the Japanese player has to figure out a sequence of events and tricks to be able to meet the victory conditions, probably a combination of frontal assaults and outmaneuvering, traveling on the sea to try to take control of the rear guard of the opponent, to use the unit that has free landing to cut supply lines. There are just different things that need to be done. And again, in such a tightly packed and concise game, it is really good that you still have different levels of experience, different decisions that you need to make. So the game, yes, may have gray areas when it comes to the rules, but if you figure out how to do things, if you can house rule things here and there, then you have a game that definitely is still interesting to play. And for a filler, for something that you can play on an airplane, definitely will keep you entertained. The game is more balanced and challenging than I thought at the beginning. Again, I thought the Japanese player was going to have an easy time winning the game, but it took me 3 solitaire games before the Japanese side could win, and that was even just a limited victory. The game works very well solitaire, no hidden information, and when there's such a strong dichotomy between defender and attacker, such two different roles to be played, to me it becomes particularly easy to switch my attention, to switch my perspective, and to play both sides independently at the best of my possibilities. So this game as a game to play on an airplane works perfectly well, but I think just if you print a copy and you play it at home, it is a simple, light, quick game that can keep you entertained with a very nice, interesting puzzle.